Hi guys, welcome back. We have Brie again. As I said in our last episode, we are going to be talking about the menstrual cycle today. So Brie, could you explain what the menstrual cycle is?
So the menstrual cycle, which is really one of my favorite things to talk about, is a reasonably predictable pattern of hormonal change in a woman's life. Most women will get their first period between 11 and 14 or 15 years old, sometimes a bit earlier, sometimes a bit later, but that's generally when we see it onsetting. Fun fact, that's called menarche.
Okay.
Their first ever period is called menarche.
Never knew that.
And then that continues in a reasonably predictable pattern. And we usually say every 28 days. Now, every woman is different. Some women have 22-day cycles and some women have 36-day cycles, but broadly speaking, we use 28 days as the average. And that continues except for extreme illness and pregnancy until you are in your mid to late 40s, like sometime in your 40s, when we would expect to see women be moving toward menopause. Now, perimenopause can start anytime from your sort of late 30s, early 40s onwards. Most women by their mid 40s are definitely experiencing some perimenopausal symptoms. And then menopause officially happens when you have had 1 year without a bleed.
Okay.
So, and the average age of menopause in the UK is about 51.
Oh, wow.
So, on average, we spend more of our lives bleeding monthly than not.
Yeah.
And I thought this was going to be just everybody knows what's going on with it.
Yeah.
And it basically turns out that we get taught about the menstrual cycle in school as children. And that's it. And we never talk about it again. Except to complain. Or to be aggravated by it. And so the predictable pattern that happens is that day one of your cycle is always the first day of your period, the first full day of bleeding. And most women bleed for an average of 3 to 5 days. As that finishes up, so at that time, at the beginning of the cycle, your levels of progesterone and estrogen are very low, almost non-existent.
Okay.
And that correlates to a reduction in serotonin production because estrogen and serotonin are connected in terms of the production. And then as the period is finishing, something called follicle stimulating hormone is kicking in, and that's what is helping to ripen the ovaries to release an egg. And then that sets off, it's like a chain of events that happen, and that sets off estrogen. And so about day 3 to 5, we start to see estrogen start to climb, and it climbs pretty steadily very quickly.
Okay.
Until about day 14, when estrogen production has peaked, at which point if you're not on birth control, an egg is released from an ovary, and it travels down the fallopian tube. And if you were trying to get pregnant, or if you were having unprotected sex at that time, and there's sperm present, the sperm will try and meet up with the egg and, fertilize, and then we would be going toward pregnancy. But the body doesn't know if it's pregnant or not for the first 14 days.
Okay.
And so consequently, what is after ovulation, the hormone that really takes over is progesterone. Progesterone is the pro-gestation hormone.
Okay.
And it is responsible for a lot of slowing down, for sort of like the nesting instinct.
Okay.
Because it's like, and so it's slowing everything in the body down. Whereas estrogen is this sort of like get out there and have fun hormone, right?
Okay.
Some people call it the Beyonce hormone. It is responsible for lubricating everything from your eyeballs to your vagina, your joints.
Okay.
Estrogen makes you think faster because the synapses in your brain actually work more quickly with estrogen present.
Okay.
Whereas progesterone sort of starts to slow things down a bit. So
Okay.
digestion can slow. That's sometimes why people feel a little bit more bloated or constipated during the second half of their cycle. Thinking can be slowed a little bit. And what I do a lot of work with is how do we sort of grab onto these changes in our hormones and use them instead of being frustrated by them.
Yeah.
So then the week before your period, which is called your premenstrual phase, a lot of women will say that they experience higher levels of anxiety, general just not feeling great, can be quite tearful or irritable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because at that point, if a pregnancy hasn't been achieved, there's been no conception. So if pregnancy is achieved, then progesterone continues to climb and climb and climb.
Okay.
If it doesn't, then what happens is both estrogen and progesterone fall away, and very sharply.
Okay.
And it's that falling away of the hormone that can lead to some of those sort of more typical PMS symptoms that we hear about. But the falling away of the hormone is what triggers the bleed,
Okay.
which then starts the whole cycle over
Okay.
again.
Okay. Wow, there's a lot of bits to that
Yes.
period of time. What are the most misconceptions of the menstrual cycle and at different periods of time? So when you're going through the
Follicular phase?
follicular phase, what do people tend to not know that they should know in those times?
So in the sense of what estrogen is trying to really do during the follicular phase, during that sort of pre-ovulation place, is biologically we are being driven to go out and find a mate.
Okay.
So what does that mean? So for instance, estrogen, as I said, is a lubricating hormone, but we also know that it makes the female face and body more symmetrical because symmetry is pleasing to the human eye. Because it's driving us out to find a mate or to appear more sexy or ready for sex, what else is attached to that is what we need to think about.
Okay.
So if I feel sexy, maybe I feel more confident.
Okay.
So it's a great time to be thinking about if you can, not everyone has this ability, but if you can schedule your work
Around.
to have a presentation the week before you ovulate is a great time to do that kind of public speaking, or to do something where you think you might need a little bit of extra confidence, because you will just naturally feel more confident at that time in your cycle. Because of course, confidence to most humans is attractive. So think of the things that we understand to be attractive, not necessarily just physically, but also from a character perspective or a person perspective. And those are the things that are going to maybe feel more present at that time in your cycle. Energy tends to be very high at that time of the cycle. Wanting to be social, wanting to get out and see people. You don't want to be at home alone with Netflix at that time of the month. Somebody says you're more likely to be spontaneous at that time of the month, right? So when somebody calls you and says, hey, do you want to go out for drinks? Yeah, I do actually.
Yeah.
That's the time of the month that you're most likely to say yes.
Okay.
So capitalizing on those,
Yeah.
using those to our advantage can be really helpful.
What's the best way to track it? To track that cycle? Is it?
I mean, there are about 100 apps
Okay.
that you can download. I have yet to find one which I think is totally fit for purpose from a therapeutic standpoint.
Okay.
But the most basic entry level into it is to get a piece of paper and just on the first day of your cycle write one.
Okay.
Or get a paper calendar or in your phone calendar. And I ask my clients to track one physical word and one emotional word all month long. And so like, you know, day 13 might be happy, you know, I feel quite happy or energized or excited, and physically maybe I just feel good.
Yeah.
There's not necessarily anything to comment on beyond I feel good in my body. I feel good about my body right now. I feel positive about how I feel and look in space, which is often when women feel the most pleased with how they look also. And then after ovulation, as progesterone starts to really take over, it's a great time of the month for deep work.
Okay.
For like head down, I need to do this like in-depth report, right? Okay. Or I need to do something strategy-wise, because although our thinking is slower, we are more likely to want to sit still for a longer period of time, right? Okay. So we've kind of got like the ability to give ourselves over more completely to any one task. Okay. Whereas when we're full of estrogen, like sitting down to like focus feels maybe a little bit too much, like too much focus sort of thing. So trying to do like deep work, thoughtful work, that kind of stuff in the second half of the cycle. And then as you come into your sort of premenstrual phase, which is where I actually think particularly tracking comes into its, like really it comes into its own. So tracking is great because you get to understand when you've ovulated, which is really important. And then as your sort of premenstrual symptoms become apparent, you're able to see, day 23 is really hard for me, right? Actually, we think about having PMS as being like this thing that happens like 2 days before the period. And a lot of women would say, actually, and this is anecdotally from the work that I've done, they actually don't often emotionally feel that bad the day or two before their period. It's like the days 4 or 5 days before their period. Okay. Day 23, day 24 often really come up as big days for a lot of people. And that's often because that's when we really see progesterone start to fall. So by the time you get to day 26, 27, 28, it's kind of bottoming out at that point. So it's less that irritability, that anxiety, that snappiness. You know, I sometimes say, like, I feel like I'm Dragon Lady on day 24. And things that I have like all the patience in the world for, day 24, I don't have the patience for them anymore. And then once we have this information, we can start to use it, right? Yeah. So like, how am I holding space for my cycle? Yeah. So like day 24, I know when it's going to come. I see it coming up in my tracking, and that week I don't expect myself to make a really wholesome, healthy, home-cooked meal that day, right? That's the day that it's like frozen pizza for dinner. That's okay. Yeah. Or it's, you know, like, I know that I'm going to need extra time in the morning that morning, so maybe I make sure I'm showered the night before. Okay. Or I shower when I get home from the school run instead of trying to do it all before I try and get my 3 children out the door. Maybe I make sure the kids' book bags are ready to go the night before instead of the next morning. Just like little things that I can do to adjust. And then as a therapist, I'm aware of it in terms of where am I in my cycle? Yeah. So not just my clients, who many of them will come in and say, oh, I had a terrible week this week because I was premenstrual, or, you know, oh, I'm about to ovulate, so I feel great, right? Which is absolutely wonderful. But also, where am I in my cycle? Am I feeling like really active? Yeah. And if I'm feeling active, am I responding to my clients with the right amount of activity? If I'm about to bleed and I'm feeling like quite, you know, a lot of people will say they feel a little bit on edge, those in that premenstrual phase. And when we get down to the nitty gritty, on edge is actually one of the most common words that people use to describe that feeling. And often it correlates to a sense of anxiety, but it's not the same as the anxiety that you feel when you've got, like, say, general anxiety, or the anxiety that you feel when you have something that's weighing on you. This is more like a on edge feeling. So if I'm feeling on edge, how am I responding to my clients? So it's really being present in my body, in my cycle, and how does that engage with my clients and their cycles and where they are.
And since you've been working with people, have you ever had an experience where their menstrual cycle, maybe they're in like a different phase and you're in a different phase, and it just doesn't sync, like, which obviously women, everyone has different cycles, different times, but how do you work with that? How do you work with, I'm on like my pre-menopausal phase and they're on their follicular I can never say the word properly. Follicular phase. How do you use that space? Because it's two different cycles happening in the same room. Like, how do you
absolutely.
use that space?
So I think this is why therapists themselves should be aware of their own cycle. Because where I am at in my cycle shouldn't necessarily have any bearing on where my client is in their cycle. I should be meeting the client where they are at as best as I can. Which is true for anything a client is bringing, right? Like, we know that clients bring lots of stuff into sessions that touches on our own lives and our own experiences. And I think any therapist who says, oh no, it doesn't, I don't, that's just a lie. That's just a lie. Right? But with anything else, the expectation is, okay, I'm going to acknowledge that kind of like silently, internally to myself. I'm going to perhaps weigh, should I offer my own experience? Is there a place of intentional, thoughtful self-disclosure around this? And then I'm going to park it. I'm going to hold it to the side, because actually for this hour, it's not about me, it's about them, right? And that's why we do the training we do, to learn how to do that. Because the natural inclination when somebody says, oh, I'm premenstrual this week and I'm having a really hard week, is we say, oh, I really struggle with PMS also. Or, oh yeah, I'm a total wreck, right? And so what happens then is that we've recentered ourselves instead of the client. So I never have discussed where I am in my own cycle in the minute to the client. I do sometimes offer things like, my day 24 is really tricky, right? I will be that, I'm willing to disclose to that level, because I think it normalizes it. It makes me more relatable. So I'm not just somebody who thinks about this academically. Oh, I experience it in my own life. Of course I am. I'm a woman. I have a menstrual cycle. But then also, because I've done so much thinking around it, I have strategies that I know work for me. And so then I offer them as a framework to the client. So I would say, as an example, I don't cook a complicated meal for my family on day 24. What in your life feels too complicated on the day that you struggle, or on the days that you're struggling, right? And they might say, and they might not have kids. They might not have a family that they're cooking for, but they might say, oh, I find getting to work for 8:30 that day really hard. And I'll say, okay, is your start time flexible? So I have a client who's recently realized that when she's premenstrual, she has a flexible start time. So she goes in late that week. She said, nobody's noticed. Nobody cares.
She's getting the work done.
She's getting the work done. She's staying a little bit later, but she has the flexibility in her life and in her work day to do that. So she just goes in a bit later, and she said it's made all the difference, right? I have another client who has recognized that the week that she's premenstrual, she needs to come to therapy twice. So we just have more holding space because the things in her life get more activated the week she's about to have her period.
Yeah.
So she just needs to have a little bit more space for that and acknowledge that. So I think it's about recognizing where I'm at. And like, for instance, at the moment, I'm doing a series on Instagram, which is broadly actually being done to my cycle because you're most aware of it when you're in those days, right?
Yeah.
So I guess people could possibly figure out where I'm at in my cycle based on what I'm posting, but I don't care that much, right? Like if a client has seen my Instagram and I'm talking about like things that happen premenstrually and they might think like, oh, Brie must be premenstrual. Fine. And that doesn't bother me. But I'm not going to center myself in a therapeutic conversation.
But how do you hold yourself in those times?
The same way I would hold myself if somebody has had an argument with their husband and wants to talk about their argument with their husband.
Yeah.
And maybe I've also had an argument that week with my husband. And when they say that, I think, oh, right, yeah, oh, that happened between myself and my husband, or I have a similar thing.
Yeah.
Or, or somebody's, talking about their relationship with their parents or with their siblings or with their children or, a difficult thing that's happened in work. Like, all of these things touch on stuff in our own lives. So I really will think, okay, oh, they're feeling very excitable. They're feeling really engaged right now. What do they need from me, right? How do I either put aside my own current feelings, or how do I use my feelings, my current state, to get underneath something? So, there's a real propensity to not want to engage with what was difficult 2 weeks ago when you're in the middle of your follicular cycle.
Okay.
So 2 weeks before, you were in the middle of PMS.
Yeah.
And you don't want to talk about that because that was 2 weeks ago, and I'm feeling a lot better now. But 2 weeks from now, you're going to feel bad again.
Yeah.
So why don't we spend some time now when you're feeling resilient and you're feeling confident and you have a brain that's making good connections because the estrogen is helping the brain. Why don't we start thinking now about what you're going to do in 2 weeks' time? Yeah. And I'm 2 weeks ahead of you. I know what it's like to be there. So I can maybe even use that to remind you, not saying, oh, well, I'm in the middle of my premenstrual phase and I can tell you that I don't feel hopeful about anything. But instead I can say, so I kind of recall that you were feeling a little bit hopeless. Yeah. How would we build support around that phase? Yeah. So that in 2 weeks' time when you're feeling a bit hopeless again, or you were really irritable about that minor issue that happened, would you still be irritable about that now? Yeah. So it's kind of like preparing them when they have the capacity to actually think about something rather than doing it when they're going through it, using the cycle to kind of work with them to prepare them for when things do come up. Exactly. Awesome. So if you had to give like the average lady girl a tip, what tip would you give them around their menstrual cycle? Track and track it again. We need 2 months of data for any diagnosis around the menstrual cycle. So if we're thinking about something like premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is broadly, in the most crude way to describe it, is like severe premenstrual syndrome. We need 2 months of data to go to anyone in the medical profession and say, I need help with this. Okay. If you don't have that, they'll just say, we need you to track for 2 months and come back. So start tracking. That's your number one thing you can do. But then you can also know your physical and emotional symptoms. So to get a diagnosis of something like PMDD, for instance, you do need to show both physical and mental symptoms, and there's a predefined list of the agreed symptoms. You have to have a certain number of them and a certain number of each, mental and physical.
Okay.
And there are some great resources online so that you can start to see if you are tracking that way or not. But with tracking, you'll be able to start identifying things like, I ovulate on day 15, not day 14, say. I broadly, have a 29-day cycle, maybe. Day 25 is my day that I feel really out of sorts and out of control and on edge. I just feel really like uncomfortable in my body the day before my period. Like all of that kind of stuff. That's just really helpful information.
Yeah.
If you can start to plan, not necessarily like plan your life around your cycle, but hold space for your cycle within your life, you're going to get more out of it, and it doesn't catch you unawares, right? I think the thing that I see consistently is the more we track, the more clients become caught out by what's happening, and so it doesn't feel like this nasty surprise when you've been tooting along, feeling really great about life, everything's going well, and then boom. And it feels like a crash, because actually if we looked at the hormonal graph, it is a pretty sharp decline in these hormones. So we know that hormones impact mood.
Awesome. And if people wanted to work with you and get to know a bit more about like the perfectionism and the menstrual cycle, where could they find you?
So I am on Instagram at dwell.therapy.
Awesome.
I have a website, dwelltherapy.co.uk, which is probably the best two places to find out about me and the kind of work that I do.
Awesome. I'll put all of that in the show notes. So if people want to reach out, they will reach out through that way.
Fab.
Guys, thank you for tuning in to another episode, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, guys. Bye.